We have some breaking news to tell you about on a story we've been covering here all week. Since we've been on the air, dozens of news outlets covering the Defense Department have left the Pentagon after refusing to agree to and sign the Trump administration's new demands that significantly curb access to and the ability to report on and cover that building, the Pentagon, and the men and women of the military. The people refusing to sign include Fox News, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's former place of work. A Pentagon reporter from the AFP posted this photo of journalists on the steps of the Pentagon after handing in their badges that gave them access to the building. A correspondent from Reuters tweeted this, quote, "The physical Pentagon bureaus of Reuters and virtually every other news organization are now officially closed. But we will continue to cover the Pentagon fairly and aggressively from outside the building, holding the U.S. military accountable." We're back with Rachel. I know you got everyone's attention, the world's attention, with your open a week ago Monday about how authoritarianism is here. It's not on the horizon. It's not something theoretical that you and I both covered in the months leading up to the election. It's not a question before the voters. It's what they have ushered in with the reelection of Donald Trump. And this is, you know, chapter one, shutting out the free press, shutting out access to the truth about the military.
Yeah, but this is also a really important chapter in what it means to stand up to authoritarianism. Nicole, we have talked about the fact that, you know, the people have been brave. Individual Americans, the people who you're going to see out this Saturday at the No Kings protests, the people who you've seen in every state of the country almost every day of the week taking some act of protest against Trump, those folks have been brave and principled and unafraid. The cowardice that we have seen has been from institutions, and that includes media organizations and news organizations, where we've seen executives over and over and over again make cowardly and craven decisions to try to appease Trump or please him in some way in the hopes that maybe that earns you another day of being allowed to operate at his pleasure. It's just been disgusting what we've seen from the most important and valuable corporations in this country and law firms and universities and all the rest of it. In this case, we've got all of those Pentagon reporters with their news organizations behind them standing up and saying, no, we are not stenographers. We are not going to work under strictures where we are only allowed to write down what you tell us we can write down. That's not journalism, and we're not going to do it under those terms. We'll do it some other way. We'll give up these bureaus, these physical bureaus inside the Pentagon, sure, and that is a compromise, absolutely. We will find other ways to do this work, because you keeping us here while we only write what you want and approve us of saying would have us working here as your lackeys rather than working as journalists, and we're journalists. I find this to be incredibly inspiring, and I don't know how it's going to result, or how it's going to resolve in terms of what happens with that press space inside the Pentagon. But when journalists and the news organizations that employ them stand up like this, particularly ones on the right, it is a good sign about the self-respect and vision and values and bravery of people who are really important to the health of our democracy. I think this is a really good sign.
Do you think it's happening because it's the military, or do you think it's happening because there's something different about the Pentagon press corps?
I think it might be happening because news organizations have realized that it's really embarrassing to cave to Trump. I think that, you know, that we haven't necessarily, you know, I think the Trump administration, people who are working for him, know what they're trying to do. I think they are trying to impose one party permanent rule, getting rid of American democracy and for all intents and purposes, and having an authoritarian takeover of the country. Like, I think they know what they're doing. So are they susceptible to changing their minds because of people protesting and calling them out for what they're doing? Maybe not at this point, although I think people are going to keep chipping away at it. But every other institution in the country that is public-facing in particular, whether it is a company, whether it is a news organization, whether it is a professional organization of every kind, I think people have now gotten the message that it is a humiliation, and it is something that you cannot live down until you change course and change your mind to bend the knee to this guy. And so I don't think anybody, any self-respecting news organization knew that they could accept these sort of rules and leave their reporters in there under these these Orwellian rules. And so I think that the weather is changing, and that institutions know it's not a good look to capitulate to this guy and to this insane stuff they're demanding of people in this country anymore.
It's something that Martin Sheen said on Saturday at our MSNBC Live event. He said, this is fleeting. And the idea that people think that this will be the weather, to use your word, forever, and that it won't at some point be the most hideous brand ever to be. I mean, imagine being Paul Weiss, right? The first law firm that capitulates to Trump. That won't always be a good look, but they will have always gone first.
Amanda, is it time for new Democratic leadership in the Senate?
I think we're looking at a moment where if Schumer folds in this shutdown, if he does not actually negotiate a written down, genuine deal that Republicans will hold to, I think he's going to start to hear calls from his own caucus to step aside because he has backed down too many times over the last 8 months. He's got to prove that he's got the backbone now.
Do you view it, Amanda, as largely a political issue? Does he have the right strategy and results, or a substance and ideology issue, as we've seen the party also look towards more progressive planks right now?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, Senator Schumer doesn't seem to have understood up until this moment that the Republican Party is not a good faith negotiator. They are not good faith partners in governance. They don't want to try and negotiate around the edges for policy. They want to burn it down. He also, I think, is not the skilled communicator we need for this moment. The shtick with him is he's got the flip phone. He doesn't even have an iPhone. I don't know if that's still true or not, but that's actually not charming anymore, given how people get information. He can't really communicate in the way we need our Democratic leadership to right now.
Congressman, you've been in there. You know how it works and how it can be hard. And Amanda's saying that Chuck's not that effective anymore, and it's probably time for him to go. What do you say?
Yeah, probably his Instagram account probably isn't the hippest, I would imagine. And at the same time, you're talking about one of the greatest strategists in the history of the Congress, a tactician's tactician. And we're a long ways from March of earlier this year. A lot has happened and transpired since then. I think Chuck Schumer understands exactly what this administration is about and what his Republican colleagues now are about, just yes men and yes women to this presidency. I agree with Amanda that they're not there to legitimately negotiate. And I think Schumer's now laid down that gauntlet. And he has kept together his caucus, with the exception of maybe 3 votes. They're winning. The people out there understand that it is the president's shutdown. It is the Republican-controlled House and Senate shutdown. It's not Democrats who are forcing this. Democrats are standing up for workers. Democrats are standing up for people who need health care in this country. And Schumer's leading that charge. But I also would like to say, Ari, he's not necessarily the leader of the country. He's the leader of the Senate. He's not the Democratic leader at this point, nor is Hakeem Jeffries. He's the leader of the House.
Who is?
We're waiting for that. We're waiting for that. Well, we don't even know yet. We're waiting for that presidential candidate to happen, and that'll happen over the next year.
Let me jump in, Congressman. You're speaking to one of the debate points, which is some folks are saying that this idea that you wait around and have a whole primary, in a couple of years from now, and find this leader, that the stakes are too high, which, of course, is something Democrats also say, and that you have to start fixing some of the party's perception. I mean, Jon Stewart is not known for his endless Chuck Schumer hate. You can't dismiss him as a hater. He's seeing a punchline in the messaging problem. And I'm going to show you some TikToks where writ large, and again, to be fair, not just Chuck Schumer, but writ large, the Democratic leaders in D.C., this is the reception on TikTok.
I am feeling incredibly angry at the Democrats right now.
Thought about it. I did a lot of reflecting, and it's actually everyone else's fault that I lost.
I'm a lifelong Democrat. It's our party that has left me feeling unsettled.
We don't resonate with the average voter. It's just a fact. Democrats are now viewed as the party of elites.
And Joe, then you say, okay, those are clips, but here's the national data. This party at this moment, more underwater, 30 points or so down than we've seen before. Joe.
No, I see that number, yes. There's no question that we have a lot of work to do. But also harken back, Ari, to my own, loss 7 years ago. Back then, at 56 years of age, I was being called Grandpa Crowley, and I'm sure that many of the same folks you just showed on Instagram were saying the same thing about me back then. What I think we have, especially as New Yorkers, we have the greatest opportunity ever to have the leader of the Senate, the leader of the House, both from New York. The opportunities they will provide for the state when and if they ever get back into power. And that's a big question, will be enormous for the Northeast and for, I think, blue cities and blue states as well. So there's an awful lot to fight for. I think we don't know who that candidate is going to be. Chuck Schumer's role right now is to win back the Senate, and I don't think he even cares about his own self. He cares more about winning back the Senate for the American people.
Amanda?
I think it's telling right now that some of the leading Senate candidates in the country in some of these battleground states are actively saying they will not vote for Chuck Schumer as majority leader if they win back the Senate. That his endorsement right now, or his and the DSCC's putting their thumb on the scale, is actually a huge mark against them. Democratic primary voters do not trust the D.C. establishment. They severely understand that the leaders that got us to this point do not have the skills nor the stomach to get us to the next one. They will not be able to get us out of this crisis. Now, I am comforted by the fact...
Well, I'll let her finish and go to you.
Sorry.
Well, I would just say I am comforted by the fact that Run for Something has seen more than 70,000 young people raise their hands to say they want to run for office just in the last year, more so than we saw in the entirety of Trump's first term. So, like it or not, the Democratic Party of the future is not going to be defined by Chuck Schumer. I'll agree with Representative Crowley on that one, but it also shouldn't be defined by him now.
I don't disagree with that notion. The idea that 70,000 people to run for office, I think that's great. I think that's going to rejuvenate our party. We need that, and we need primaries. I think it makes people better. But at the end of the day, Chuck Schumer's job right now is to do all he can to win the Senate back. And we have a tough slog against us because we don't have really great states that we're running in 2 years. So that is his number one job right now, as is his Hakeem Jeffries' job to win back the House of Representatives. And we see what's happening with the Voting Rights Act and what they're doing to this country.
And if he fails at that,
I think they both understand the odds.
If they don't win back the Senate in November, then would you look for new leadership, Congressman?
That's up to the Senate to decide. It's not up to them. You know, it's a small.
No, I know. Well, now you sound like a politician.
Decision.
Yes, it is technically up to the
reality.
Senate. Well, yes, it's technically up to the Senate.
Though.
It's up to the Senate, but we're having this discussion, and I'm asking you point blank: do you think if he doesn't win back the Senate, should he get another try? Because the question on the table from a lot of the younger members of the party is, why keep running the same people and same blueprint if you're losing?
I think if Chuck Schumer is not the leader, this doesn't necessarily mean he's not a member of the Senate. You know, that's the other point here that you're really getting to is in 2 years. That'll be up for the voters in New York to decide whether Senator Schumer is sent back to the Senate. In terms of their colleagues, that's up to the colleagues to decide. You know, it's inside baseball, Ari. As much as I want to say how someone who's going to replace Dick Durbin is going to vote in 2 years, we don't know.
Yeah, I hear you, and we're running out of time. It's not complete inside baseball.
It's not inside baseball.
Well, we just showed you a lot of people in the country who seem to know that Schumer and Jeffries are in charge, and they're looking at that. I'll give Amanda a final word as well.
Well,
if Amanda can tell me who they're going to vote for Senate, I'll listen to that.
Well, it is such a problem that he is at this moment putting his ego above the brand of the party. The fact that so many young people, and I see it on my For You page constantly, are saying, I don't want to go with the party that has this guy in the front of it, you know, standing, waving his fist, fecklessly saying, we will win. They don't think that we are fighting for them because they don't see him as a powerful communicator. They don't see Hakeem Jeffries as a powerful communicator. They didn't see Joe Biden as a powerful communicator who can speak to the issues they care about. So it might feel like inside baseball, but what it looks like is someone putting their ego above the party and above the country.
Well, I have a terrific group to talk this over. Barbara Starr is a former board member of the Pentagon Press Association and CNN Pentagon correspondent for, 21 years. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling served as commander of U.S. Army Europe. He is with me as well as here in studio. We have Oliver Darcy, founding and lead author of the Status Daily Briefing. So welcome all. We'll go ladies first, Barbara. So even though all of these members of the Pentagon Press Corps no longer have press badges, I mean, I assume that means they're going to continue reporting. So how do they do that? What does that look like now? And how does it change starting today and going forward?
Well, reporters are going to report no matter where they are. That's just, the fact. And they will continue. They can do it by phone. They can meet in person. They can do email. They can work from home. They can meet at a local coffee bar. They can work off of Capitol Hill, or, sit in their cars and work off their cell phones. This is not going to stop reporting, but I think you have to focus, as I know everyone is, on the real bottom line here. This is about the public's right to know, the American people's right to know how their tax money is being spent at the Pentagon. What is it now? Nearly $1 trillion. What is that money being spent on? What are the troops doing? How are the troops doing on any number of issues? These are all things that are the public's right to know. Nothing to do with classified information. And, the work will go on.
So I'm curious, though, Barbara, your response to Secretary Hegseth's claim. These are basically common sense measures. They're meant to protect classified and national security type of information. I guess I'm asking, logistically, were there times that you were just walking the halls of the Pentagon and you'd happen upon somebody and they said to you, hey, I've got something and it's classified and I'm going to tell you right here in the hallway? Is that where you would get stuff?
No. I got to tell you, in all my years, nobody, classified information didn't leap out of the hallways into my hands. General Hertling, who, of course, served in the Pentagon, can explain in much greater detail than I can. But classified information, classified workspaces in the Pentagon are all behind locked doors, cameras, locks, heavily monitored. Reporters have no access to that information. And Mr. Hegseth knows this, or he should know it. He is concerned, obviously, about leaks of classified information, as is every defense secretary. But you go after the leakers, there's not a reason to go after the free press in this country. I don't know of any reputable news organization that goes out there and solicits classified information. The really disturbing fact about what he's doing, of course, is that he's also trying to restrict access to unclassified information. This is why reporters have to turn in their passes. They could potentially be prosecuted for having a conversation, for asking a question about unclassified information that hasn't been pre-approved by Mr. Hegseth. Reporters are not Pentagon stenographers.
That is just remarkable. They could possibly be prosecuted for asking a question. I'm curious, Oliver, what you think of the way this has gone down with the media, the unification here. Everybody from the Washington Times to the New York Times is in opposition to this. What does that say to you?
Well, it says that they don't want to be propagandists. That's really what it comes down to.
Or stenographers, as Barbara says, right.
And that's what Pete Hegseth wants. He wants them to go into the Pentagon, take the government-approved messaging and relay that to audiences. That is not journalism. That is really akin to what you see in places like North Korea, where you have government-approved anchors relay the government message to audiences. That's propaganda. And so these organizations, they cannot sign this. It would be contrary to everything they stand for. And I think we should point out that Pete Hegseth is someone who, as a member of many members of this administration did, said he was a pro-free speech guy, right? He's the guy that wants people to be allowed to have free speech. And here he is. He's trying to chill free speech inside the Pentagon. That's really what it comes down to. And as a result, he is depriving the public of an understanding of what is happening inside one of the most powerful institutions on this planet.
Do you think it gives OAN, the one that has said, yeah, we'll stay, do they have an advantage by staying?
I don't know if they have much of an advantage. I think actually the reporters who have actual sources inside the Pentagon are going to have the real advantage here, because they're still going to communicate with them and get the real story behind the scenes. OAN, to be clear, is a propaganda network. It's a Donald Trump propaganda network. And so this is not surprising that they have gone along with this. I think it is surprising to some extent that outlets like Newsmax have also said we're not going to follow.
And Fox.
And Fox News.
Again, Hegseth's own former professional home,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. And so that's a real slap in the face to him, I think, that his own former employer is saying, you've gone way overboard here. But Pete Hegseth, again, Fox News is all about, we don't like safe spaces. We're not snowflakes, right? Pete Hegseth is behaving like a snowflake who needs a safe space to protect him from the act of reporting, which is insane.
So, General, give me the view from the military side. The president has defended this policy by saying the press can be, quote, very disruptive in terms of world peace and maybe security for our nation. Again, that's the president saying it. How about you? What do you say to that?
Well, first, if I can, Alex, I'd like to give a shout out to both Barbara and Oliver, because they're both the best at their business. And I worked with Barbara not only in the Pentagon for the one tour I was there, but also in Iraq when she visited often as one of those reporters. What I tell you is I do have a lot of experience with journalists while in uniform. Every military senior ranking person does. I'd reinforce what Barbara said, that the entire Pentagon is not a classified space, as Secretary Hegseth said. If it were, people wouldn't be conducting tours through the Pentagon with a lot of civilians on a daily basis. But what I'd also suggest was what we're talking about are two different institutions. One, the military, exists to defend the republic. The other one, the media, exists to inform it. And together, they protect the same ideal, which is self-government based on public trust. If you lose that trust, if the people aren't getting informed, if the military isn't doing the things that it's supposed to do, as they get paid so much to do in terms of a budget from Congress, then you're going to lose that public trust. And that's what concerns me the most. You know, again, like I said, I had a lot of experience dealing with journalists. From a military perspective, I don't speak from all senior officers, but I will tell you, I welcomed the press because it gave us a chance to tell our story of what soldiers were doing, of what operations were going on, of the kind of issues that we had, of the misread of the American public sometime that journalists were informing. And only those who were afraid of the military, afraid of the media, who haven't developed that trust that I was just talking about, they're the ones that tend to put draconian rules on the press, and it doesn't help the republic. That's the thing that I'm most concerned about. And I think not only, you know, I'll make a statement, I think you've seen all of the members of the Pentagon Press Corps run counter to this policy, but you're also seeing a lot of military, retired military, who can speak up against it, because we know how important the free press and freedom of speech is in a free society.
And you know, Barbara, it would be one thing if the secretary, again, former employer Fox News, was giving regular briefings. He is doing the opposite. And according to The Hill, Hegseth has not briefed Pentagon reporters in nearly 4 months, and the press secretary, Kingsley Wilson, has not conducted a briefing in 2 months. Any idea why?
You know, I think it's begging the question that's being, I would tell you, is being whispered about more and more, which is basically, what is Pete Hegseth afraid of? He clearly is deeply concerned about leaks. That is valid for any defense secretary. We'll make a side comment here that his own issue with so-called Signalgate, putting potentially classified information on Signal, still has to be resolved. It's fine if he's concerned about leaks. He, however, also seems to be extremely focused on trying to impress President Trump with just how tough he is. And President Trump is responding to that. He may want to come across as tough, but what he's coming across as, I think many people believe, is someone who is very fearful. He's out there yelling, waving his hands around, insulting the press corps by name, insulting them as a professional entity. This is not something that many people, I think, believe shows strength. It's kind of a sense of fearfulness on his part, so he gets louder and louder in his criticism. And so far, the only substantive interviews he's done have been with his former employer, Fox News. Now we'll see what happens with all of that.
So, Oliver, the president has indicated that these new restrictions may not be relegated only to the Pentagon. Here's what he said on Tuesday about that.
You know, we have an option here, as you know, the press years ago moved into the White House. It used to be across the street. We could move them. You're lucky I'm president, because we could move them very easily across the street. They used to be there. They would have more room. We have a beautiful, nice space. You can sit all by yourselves and have fun. Instead, you walk around the White House talking to anybody that can breathe.
Okay, it is one thing, and it's a very serious thing, to not have access to the Pentagon. The president there implying maybe it could get cut off within the White House. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I would not rule anything out because this president has assaulted the press in a number of ways, whether it's filing lawsuits against them, smearing them by organization, and going after them in a number of ways. So you can't rule anything out. And he has had this fantasy, I think, of kicking the press off of White House grounds. Former Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham from his first term had said that that was something that was floated and he wanted. But I have a hard time thinking that this television-obsessed president is going to boot the cameras from the White House. He loves sitting there, like he did right on that screen, talking to the press, knowing his remarks are being carried live by other networks. And so, whether he actually follows through and exiles the press from White House grounds, it's certainly possible, but, I have a hard time seeing it.
So how do you help your 20,000 federal employees reconcile with the fate that's in the hand of a man who doesn't give a damn about them?
That's right, Michael. Doesn't give a damn. In fact, when he was writing Project 2025, he said, my goal is to traumatize the federal workers and have them so traumatized they feel like they're villains and they don't want to come to work. And that's the philosophy he's brought right into the Trump administration. And here we are, some 700,000 workers are furloughed. As you noted already, we had thousands who had been fired. He says, I'm going to fire thousands more. Here's the thing. In a shutdown, it's harder legally to actually do a reduction in force. And so while the president and vote are saying, well, we're using the opportunity presented by shutdown, it's actually harder now. And so the judge said, hey, what's your legal justification for doing these firings? And they said, we're not giving you one. And it was just like, it's because we're the executive, we can do what we want.
We're all powerful, almighty.
And thus the judge said, well, you have no argument to support it? Well, no, you can't do that because we're a nation of laws. And that's what we need to hear so much more of. We're a nation of laws, and the laws have to be followed. Because quite frankly, a lot of what the Supreme Court has been saying is, well, the president can't be held accountable for breaking the laws, and he can do. And then knowing he can do pardons, the whole executive branch feels like it's above the law.
Senator, you've called on OMB Director Vogt to resign. One, why? And two, do you think there are any Republicans in the chamber who would also like to see him resign?
Well, I think there are, Alicia. I called on this in partnership with Leader Schumer and with Patty Murray, the head of the Appropriations Committee, and with Gary Peters, who oversees Homeland Security, because those are all of the folks who really have oversight of the budget process. And what we have seen with Russell Vogt is not just this huge disregard for federal workers who are getting up every day trying to make this nation work for all of us, but in addition, we have seen him implement his strategy to move the power of the purse, constitutionally assigned to Congress, to the President of the United States. And he's been very successful at that. Slow-walking funds, freezing funds, impounding funds, putting forward this kind of new idea called a pocket rescission, which you can just think of it kind of like Cinderella and her carriage. And when the carriage hits midnight, it turns into a pumpkin. That's what he did with funding under that pocket rescission. And so it's like line item veto for the president. It's unconstitutional. And he's evoking this whole authoritarian strategy, supporting this attack on due process, this attack on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and freedom of press. The man is a major menace to the vision of a republic with a division of powers and power by and for the people.
Senator, obviously, day 15 of this government shutdown, this administration believes that they can do whatever they want. While this is happening, the Senate, the House is just looking over at the Capitol. I don't think the House is in session. But I know the senators are here, and you all have been continuously in session, and you've been voting on bills. Senator Thune, Leader Thune says that Senate Majority Leader Thune says he is going to schedule a Thursday vote on a defense appropriation bill. Basically, this bill, I'm not going to play the sound, but basically this is a bill that would fund the defense appropriations. It would fund the Defense Department, and they're looking to potentially attach some other things onto this. This bill was it passed your committee earlier this summer. You were only one of 3 Democrats to oppose it. Couple that with what we saw from the president earlier, where he issued an executive action on troop pay. And has directed congressionally allocated funds to be diverted to pay the troops. Are you for any of these? The defense appropriations bill, which would essentially, if that passes, then it would pay the troops because the Defense Department will be funded. Or do we support this executive action? I would argue it is stealing money that Congress appropriated, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and as Sydney Cam Locker-Dove said yesterday, the Congresswoman, and everybody's broke.
Well, Simone, there will be a vote on a motion to proceed to the House bill. And the House bill does not at all meet the framework that the Senate established. And furthermore, there's nothing in the House bill that prevents the president from doing what he's been doing, and that is shutting down the programs unilaterally that he doesn't like. So in other words, we'll have a bipartisan vote. You all come and help us out. And by the way, the president's going to be able to say, hey, that program's not in alignment with my administration's priorities, so I'm just slow walking and not funding it. That has to be fixed. This is the line between a democracy where Congress writes the law about what programs and how much, and a dictatorship where a president or a dictator in some form says, no, these are the programs and how they're being funded. So this issue of what's in the House bill and the fact that it's not the Senate numbers that were agreed to, and it does not have a provision that prevents the president from simply slashing the programs that he thinks Democrats like, that's a big problem. So whether we proceed to it without a prior understanding, I don't think we should. I think there needs to be a prior understanding. Always you have an agreement about the total numbers between the House and Senate leadership. That does not exist for this. So this is very, very different. I hope we do not pass this motion to proceed.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The modern Republican Party under Donald Trump is an increasingly extreme organization. It's trafficked in some of the worst, most disgusting, hateful bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism. It's been part of their public pronouncements, and we're learning it's even worse behind closed doors. Just yesterday, Politico published some private chat messages from about a dozen leaders of the Young Republican group across the country. MSNBC has not independently verified those chats, but Politico's reporting revealed a culture where racist, anti-Semitic, and violent rhetoric circulate freely. This was horrible, gross stuff. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, the rhetoric here is a core part of the formation of an entire subsection, a whole MAGA-centric cohort of conservatives. And when the news of these chats broke yesterday, you saw a really interesting dynamic playing out. So some Republicans, different levels in different parts of the country, did, I think, the natural thing, which was move to condemn what they read, condemn the chat members. Many of the people on that chat were fired or had job offers rescinded. The Black Conservative Federation, for instance, said, quote, let us be absolutely clear. Racism is not conservatism. Bigotry, hatred, and moral rot dressed up as jokes or free speech are the very evils that our movement must reject with moral clarity. The group called on every Republican leader, from national figures to grassroots activists, to denounce this behavior without hesitation or excuse. And again, to be fair, many Republicans were doing that until yesterday into today, when someone rode in to stop them. When Trump's vice president said, quit it, leave the kids alone. J.D. Vance is himself a creature of this extremely online right-wing underworld. One wonders what's in his chats, where he gained notoriety last year for following lots of white supremacist accounts, including a self-proclaimed historian who praised Hitler and claimed that Winston Churchill was the chief villain of World War II. He still follows those accounts to this day, and maybe he just likes to read widely. Today, Vice President J.D. Vance did the thing that he always does. It's the, oh, just get over it approach.
By focusing on what kids are saying in a group chat, grow up. I'm sorry, focus on the real issues. Don't focus on what kids say in group chats. If you put something in a group chat, assume that some scumbag is going to leak it in an effort to try to cause you harm or cause your family harm. But the reality is that kids do stupid things, especially young boys. They tell edgy, offensive jokes. Like, that's what kids do.
That's what kids do. Kids, young boys tell edgy jokes. Now, just to be clear, the members of the Young Republicans are not 9 years old, and they are not 15 or 16. In fact, they range in age from 18 to 40. J.D. Vance is 41. The people in this chat weren't young boys. They weren't kids. They were career Republican political operatives in their mid-20s and mid-30s, otherwise known as adults or grown-ups or fully formed moral agents responsible for their actions. Like Peter Giunta, he's one of them. Until today, he was the chief of staff for New York Republican state legislator Michael Riley. Giunta worked for the assemblyman for 5 years. When the chair of the Arizona Young Republicans asked if the New Yorkers in the chat were watching an NBA playoff game, Junta responded, "I'd go to the zoo if I wanted to watch monkey play ball." Not a child, not a young kid, a grown man. And again, he chose to say that. That's his right in America. You can say that. He also ridiculed black people, Indian women, female and non-white pilots, and wrote, quote, "I love Hitler." He threatened that anyone who voted against him in an upcoming election is, quote, "going to the gas chamber." Again, J.D. Vance thinks he's a young boy or a kid and that these are edgy jokes. Junta has since been fired. He has also apologized, said the chats were released by a rival as part of character assassination. Then you got William Hendricks, that's the Kansas Young Republicans vice chair. At 24, he was one of the youngest chat members. Again, 24, a grown adult. Now, Politico says Hendricks used variations of the N-word more than a dozen times in those chats. Hendricks also used an anti-gay slur, deployed racist expressions we won't repeat here. He was also a full-time communications assistant for Kansas Republican Attorney General Chris Kobach until he was fired yesterday. Hendricks didn't return Politico's request for comment. These guys are not alone. Other members include a sitting Vermont state senator. Turns out you can't elect little boys to be a state senator. This state senator suggested in the chat that non-white women didn't bathe. And a Catholic high school counselor who responded to a gas chamber remark with the retort, quote, "I'm ready to watch people burn now." She has since lost her job as a counselor. Again, these are the people J.D. Vance went to bat for today. Adults, grown-ups, people who work in politics. The whole point here is to send the message from J.D. Vance. This behavior is good, fine, actually encouraged. It's part of what defines you as part of this in-group, like being an edgy edgelord who makes offensive jokes. That it will be defended by Republicans in the absolute highest offices, not by Democrats like New York Governor Kathy Hochul, who we'll be hearing from later in the show.
Some bad apples. These are the future of the Republican Party. This was so vile. It is hard to find the words to put into context. This is not one person saying they love Hitler. There's a whole lot of people saying things that are so disgusting and so abhorrent that everybody from the president on down should condemn them. There needs to be consequences. This bull has to stop.
I happen to agree. The problem is this is part of the ideological formation of the new MAGA vanguard to kind of just soak your brain, right? Marinate it in the most extremist, discredited, destructive views in all of human history, right? Start with flirting with ultra ideas like maybe Hitler had a point. Then you're just kind of playing around with outright Nazism. And then before you know it, maybe it's not so ironic anymore. In fact, on that topic, this is kind of an odd one. Today, a Nazi swastika superimposed on an American flag was found displayed on a bulletin board in a Republican congressman's office in Capitol Hill. And according to Politico, that swastika you see there was visible to participants in an online meeting on the cubicle wall behind a congressional staffer for Republican Congressman Dave Taylor of Ohio. The staffer has not responded to requests for comment. A spokesperson for Taylor said the congressman believed the swastika ended up in his office as a result of, quote, foul play or vandalism, and he called for the Capitol Police to investigate. We'll let you know if they crack the case on that one. This stuff doesn't just permeate the culture of conservatism at this moment. It is the culture, by and large. These are J.D. Vance Republicans. And they are executing an agenda for Donald Trump that you can see when masked armed men grab non-white people off of American streets at the very same time that an army of lawyers are attempting to undo decades of civil rights laws and protections. You see it in the racist tropes being used in propaganda by Trump's Department of Homeland Security, including using terminology like invasion and cultural decline and remigration, a term that was coined by white supremacists in Europe to replace a more direct term, ethnic cleansing. You see it in new reporting by the New York Times today on a Trump plan for radical overhaul of the U.S. refugee system, one that would slash the program to its bare bones while giving preference to English speakers, white South Africans, and Europeans. Taking a program that exists to save lives of the most marginalized, at-risk people on Earth, and turning it into what Times calls Trump's vision of immigration to help mostly white people who say they are being persecuted while keeping the vast majority of other people out. It's all plain as day, whether it's in a private chat or in public. This is what we got. This is the world Trump is building. And the young Republicans in that chat and the halls of Congress have clearly gotten the memo. They're already working in the party in state capitals and executive offices. They understand in this moment that extremist hatred is at the core of what it means to be a Trump Republican.